This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are
created equal.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Created equal.
This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm in the studio with Kerry Jr. II. He is the show's producer.
Good morning, Stephen.
Hey, Kerry.
Yeah, the city of Detroit's relationship with homeownership is very complicated, and it continues to get more complicated as days
I think that's a very mild way to describe what goes on here. We've had a lot of trouble, especially with people who are just barely hanging on to their homes in the first place, and the aggressive policy that we have here about tax collection on people's properties. If you don't pay your property taxes for 3 years, you become eligible for tax foreclosure, in which the county can decide to take your property as a way of trying to recoup the money that you owe. They then turn around and sell that property at an auction that takes place every fall, and they get to keep the proceeds, even beyond what the taxes owed were. And that's where there has been a real controversy in recent years, this idea of quote-unquote profiting off of these tax foreclosures. Wayne County has done this a lot because we have so many folks in Detroit who have had trouble paying their property taxes. But the Michigan Supreme Court had a recent ruling that changes the picture.
Yeah, exactly. The Michigan Supreme Court recently ruled that you can sue to try and get back those recouped profits from the tax foreclosures. And so now that opens up a question of whether or not residents or landlords are going to benefit from that new ruling. Who does it benefit the most? And we understand that there is an opportunity here now for that massive profit that I wouldn't conceive of initially. Our counties could make that much money off of those tax foreclosures. You lose your home, yet the county is still able to kind of recoup the dollars from the sales on that. But now we can see what happens, even potentially retroactive sales before 2020 ruling initially, but they stopped making the money from those profits, from those foreclosures.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty complicated stuff, and we've got three people here who are really well versed in what's going on and are going to be great at explaining it to our listeners. But before we get to them, I just want to say that as complicated as this is, there is a very simple premise at the center of it, which is about the nature of home ownership in this city and the wealth that has been taken in many ways from home owners through all kinds of policies and decisions that were made, but this is one of them that has fueled that taking of wealth from particularly middle class and poor Detroiters, and so it's very important, and it's important that we understand what's going on here and can adjust policy to help folks who are having trouble. But it is complicated, and I'm glad that we have folks who know a lot more about it than I do. We've got Alex Alsop. He is the Vice President of Research and Development for Regrid. He's also author of the Substack at the Chargeback. Ted Phillips is here. He is the director of the United Community Housing Coalition. And we've got Nusrat Rahman. She is an economic mobility reporter for the Detroit Free Press and for Bridge Detroit. So,
perfect voices.
Let's get started. Alex Alsop, Ted Phillips, Nusrat Rahman, welcome to Created Equal. It's great to have all three of your minds here for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Yeah. So,
thank you.
Alex, I'm going to start with you, and I'm starting with you because I saw when this ruling came down, you were pretty active on social media talking about what was happening, trying to explain what happened, and then, of course, trying to explain who would be affected by all of this. So I want to give you a chance to open up there. What is this ruling about, and what does it mean?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, Stephen. So the Supreme Court ruling sort of clarified an earlier ruling from 2020 in a case called Raffaelli versus Oakland County, which said that moving forward, if counties sold properties at auction for more than the tax debt owed, the former owners of that property needed a way to be able to get those what are referred to as windfall profits in excess of the tax debt owed. The case that was decided on the other day asked the Supreme Court to decide, does the Raffaelli ruling from 2020 apply retroactively? Meaning, do properties that sold prior, in tax auctions prior to 2020 statewide, are they eligible for the former owners to go after those windfall profits? And the Michigan Supreme Court said yes. Raffaelli applies retroactively, and former property owners can go after windfall profits that were generated in auctions prior to 2020. And the auctions started around 2002, 2003, so it would ostensibly go back that far.
Yeah, I was going to say, how far back are we talking about? And you have concerns about who benefits from this, and I should make that clear that in some ways this would seem like a victory, a potential victory, for individual homeowners who lost their homes because they fell behind on taxes, that they might be entitled to some of the money that the county made off of the sale. You see it as a little more complicated than that.
That's right. So, my analysis is going to be very Detroit-centric, but, despite being only, I think, around 7% of Michigan's population in the 2010s, Detroit was home to 60% of all tax foreclosures statewide. So, a Detroit-centric analysis is not, a small sample size. That's the majority of tax foreclosures that happened in the state of Michigan. And so I think that the ruling in Raffaelli and the other day both are often sort of cast as some sort of justice for homeowners who lost their homes to tax foreclosure. And of course, there have been many of them, and there's absolutely enormous amounts of restorative justice that's due to them. But I do not think that these rulings amount to anything like that for Detroit homeowners. There are three things that we need to look at to see if these rulings would actually help former homeowners. One, how many homeowners in tax auctions prior to 2020 actually saw their homes sell? How many sold for more than the tax debt owed? That is the condition that creates windfall profits. And then what is that amount? What is the difference between the tax debt owed and how much a former homeowner's home ultimately sold for? And so when I look at the data, I have data that I can use back to about 2013, which encompasses by far the largest years of the tax foreclosure auction. And if you look at the people in those auctions that were harmed the most, in my opinion, that's occupied homes, both renters and homeowners. This does nothing for renters. If you were a renter in a tax foreclosed home, subsequently evicted, there's nothing for those renters in this ruling because obviously they were not the owner of the property. So between about 2013 and 2019, about 10,000 renters went through tax foreclosure. So this wouldn't help them.
Right. Well, they lost their homes. They lost their homes, but they were not owners, so they would not be entitled to any kind of compensation here.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. In that same period, 2013 to 2019, about 20,000 Detroit homeowners went through tax foreclosure. So then the question is, how many of those sold at auction for more than the tax debt owed? And if you look at 2015, which is the biggest tax auction that we've had, there were about 25,000 Detroit properties in the 2015 tax auction. about 6,400 of those were occupied homes. So we had 6,400 homeowners go through the tax auction in 2015. Only 400 of those 6,400 homes sold at auction for more than the tax debt owed.
Okay.
About 7%, I think, 6% of the 6,400 homes. And the median amount by which they sold in excess of tax debt owed was around $4,500, which isn't nothing, but it's not anything like restorative justice
Sure.
when home values today are like $100,000.
Right.
And so the point here is that it is if you take that 6 or 7% and apply it to the 20,000 homeowners that lost their homes between 2013 and 2019, there's probably only out of those 20,000, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 that might be able to see something as a result of this retroactive ruling. But again, it's a very small minority because a lot of these homes didn't sell, and for those that did, very often they didn't sell for more than the tax debt owed.
Yeah. And yet, Wayne County, according to a story that Nusrat Rahman wrote in the Free Press and in Bridge Detroit, between 2012 and 2019, Wayne County collected $92 million in windfall profits from tax foreclosure sales. So where did that money come from, Alex?
So the way that the tax auction works is and again, this is statewide. It's kind of a heads I win, tails you lose proposition.
Mm-hmm.
If a property sells for more than the tax debt owed, the county gets to keep that money. If a property sells for less than the tax debt owed or doesn't sell at all, that doesn't eat out of the profits on properties that sold for more. It goes into something called the chargeback,
mm-hmm.
and it's actually charged back to the city in which that tax foreclosed property sits.
Yes.
So if there's a loss for the county on a property, they send that loss to the city, and if there's a profit, then they keep that profit themselves. And so basically they're able to, add up all those profits over the years. And it amounted to, my estimate is that it amounts to about $90 million between 2012 and 2019 in windfall profits. But that's actually that's about 1/4 of the total profits that the Wayne County Treasurer's Office got out of this system. The vast majority of profits don't come from the auction.
The vast sales.
Majority of they don't come from the sales. They come from people paying delinquent property taxes plus 18%
plus the
annual interest, penalties, and fees. And none of these lawsuits challenge that at all. They all explicitly concede the point that the county can continue to collect that money.
Yeah. Nusrat, I want to bring you into the conversation here. You've written a story this week about what the Michigan Supreme Court ruled, but you've written over time about housing and housing insecurity in Detroit. I want to have you give our listeners a sense of how much damage tax foreclosure and these auctions have done in neighborhoods that you cover with people that you write about. This is, in my estimation, it's a primary driver of poverty in the city. This tax foreclosure issue that we deal with. Give me your sense of what all this means.
Yeah. And I think, thanks for having me. I think Alex did a wonderful job breaking down this really complicated issue. And it's one that I think is important for Detroiters and all of Michiganders to understand. I think housing is at the core of the concerns that residents of the city have, whether they're homeowners, whether they're renters. And I think tax foreclosure and the ripple effect of the crisis that happened is something that still persists. I mean, you sit on city council meetings, you listen to the public comments, and it's something that people bring up regularly. So it's a persistent concern that people definitely have. And I think, like I said, breaking down the implications of this ruling is extremely important, not only for Detroiters, but for Michiganders, because it really lays out the process of tax foreclosure. And, the fact that counties have been able to kind of keep this money, and now the Supreme Court has said, in 2020 has said that no, counties can't keep the money. It belongs to property owners. And now the Supreme Court has said that indeed it applies before 2020, right? And so something that I wanted to bring up is that, yes, it's going to potentially impact tens of thousands of people, according to one attorney I talked to who's been steeped in this world, but it's also going to hit county coffers. And so I talked to the Michigan Association of Counties, and they said that although they don't know the impact, the fiscal impact at this point, they've advised their counties to prepare for this, right? We don't know where the money is going to come from, but it's something that they've prepared for. I know that Alex mentioned the analysis that he did, but I was listening to the oral argument from some of the attorneys back in March for this case in particular, and they said that from 2013 to 2020, Wayne County saw more than $120 million in surplus proceeds, whereas Lake County, which is on the other side of the state, collected $2.3 million in excess funds. So there definitely is a disparity, and I was talking to some other county treasurers whose surplus proceeds are in the low millions, and so Wayne County is definitely going to be a county to watch. I got a comment back from Eric Sabri, and he said that his office is looking into the law right now, or rather the opinion, and trying to decide how to move forward, but they're establishing a claims process for taxpayers who lost their property, are entitled to surplus proceeds. So, pursuant to this court order. So it's something to definitely watch, and we're going to continue to report on it. But just going back to your question, I think tax foreclosure is a major issue for Detroiters. And I think what can make it convoluted is how complicated it is, right? So just spending Monday just reading through this 58-page court opinion was a doozy in and of itself. And I'm not an attorney, I'm a reporter. And so I think, I think Detroiters deserve to know what's going on with the high court and how it could impact them.
Yeah. Ted Phillips, this is, of course, the world that you work in as well, as an advocate on behalf of renters and homeowners in the city. I'd love to get your take on what this means and what this means for poverty in the city, which is so connected to housing and our problems with housing.
I think it's hard to say, because I think it's hard to say how many were homeowners, how many were investors. My suspicion is that most of those that will benefit from this are investors. I think Alex is right about for a long period of time, properties were not selling for what the taxes were on them. I remember back in the Kilpatrick years, they decided to add water bills to taxes and cost enormous numbers of people their homes. But then when it came to actually collecting on that, the properties didn't sell for the taxes plus the water bills, and the water board took a bath. Bad joke. But it happened. And so they finally stopped doing that. And I think probably up until about 15 or 16, most properties sold for, that we had any experience with, certainly low-income owners' properties sold for less than what the taxes were. We used to, when from about 2010 to 15 or 16, until we got into the Make It Home program, which is a little different, we used to do canvassing in August to make sure that people knew that their properties were in foreclosure.
Right.
And we would run into tenants all the time. And I personally would do this back when I was younger and could walk better. And I would frequently have them tell me that, no, you're wrong, sir. This property is not in foreclosure. My landlord has worked out an agreement with the Wayne County Treasurer, and they're going to go make some payments in October. What did that mean? That meant that they were going to go to the auction in October, skirt the taxes that they owed for $3,000 or $4,000, $5,000, whatever, and buy the property back in October for $500 to $1,000. None of that money ever got collected, and it's kind of missed in this. So it seems ironic that if some of these investors did make a bad play on certain properties and lose them for more than what the taxes were, that they would now be able to recoup that money while skirting all their taxes for all of these other years.
Yeah.
Now, as a result of that, the state passed a law a few years back saying that no former owner could bid on their properties unless they were bidding the entire amount of the taxes due. And we fought against that because it was pretty obvious what would happen. And what has happened is that simply the investors have changed their corporate names and proceeded to buy their properties back anyway. Now the properties are not selling for very often not selling for less than the taxes, but still they're allowed to participate in that. And the only persons that really got excluded from that were homeowners. Can't find a way to change their name. And we said this before the law was even enacted. So this was not a way to get at it. So, I mean, certainly we're going to see what we can do to go back through records we have to see, who do we show, what homeowners do we show as being foreclosed where there was more collected in the auction than what was owed in taxes. I think that's going to be a hard task to do.
Yeah.
And also then finding them. And then the other piece would be that, again, the population we work with is Detroit. Population very specifically we work with is more the low-income populations. And, the homes, unfortunately, in those areas very often did not sell for more than what the taxes were.
Yeah. Okay, we need to take a quick break. And when we come back, I am going to continue this conversation with Ted Phillips, Alex Alsop, and Nusrat Rahman. We are talking about tax foreclosure here in the city of Detroit, property tax foreclosure, and a new ruling that says when the county profits from the sale of those properties it forecloses on, people will be entitled to payment in the amount of those profits. It is going to be applied retroactively. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm glad you've joined us. We're talking about property tax foreclosure in Detroit, an issue that has been with us for a long time. It is a primary driver of some of the problems that we have with economic mobility and poverty in the city. A new ruling by the Michigan Supreme Court would at least seem to bring a little bit of justice to homeowners who've lost their homes to tax foreclosure and seen the county then sell those homes at prices that exceed the taxes that were owed. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Because of those complications, I've got three people who have paid a lot of attention to this issue with us in the studio today. Alex Alsop is VP of Research and Development for Regrid and the author of the Substack, The Chargeback. Ted Phillips is the director of the United Community Housing Coalition, and Nusrat Rahman is an economic mobility reporter for the Detroit Free Press and Bridge Detroit. I want to talk a little more in this segment about the role that investors, or as some people might call them, speculators, play in Detroit and in the housing market, and what role they will play in this this ruling that says that retroactively homeowners will be able to collect from the county the money that the county made off of those properties. Of course, speculation is another driver of some of the housing problems that we have here in Detroit. It gets complicated, though, when you start to think about this. But, Ted, I'm going to start with you this time. You say this is a boon, a seeming boom for investors. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I would love to see the data on it, but my reaction would be that probably most of the homes that sold for greater amounts were investor-owned homes. They're the ones who will come to the front. They're the ones very often who part of their business plan was to not pay taxes, and in most instances that worked. They got out of paying 3 years worth of taxes for $500 to $1,000 for many years during the 2002 to 2015 or so period, and now they're going to be getting on the few that failed in their business plan, they're going to be getting back the excess money that the treasurer collected.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I certainly agree that any individual homeowner that got caught up, particularly those during this period that should have been exempted from taxes because of the state poverty tax exemption law that Detroit has made miraculous progress on in the last several years, but was very different back in that time. Certainly, I agree that those folks, if their homes sold in this fashion, should be given some compensation, even if it is, only the $4,500 or whatever. They certainly should be given that. But I do think that there's some unfairness to those that, as opposed to couldn't pay, consciously didn't pay, and then now benefit from this.
Nusrat, can we talk some also about the role that these investors play in our neighborhoods and in housing in the city, the disruption that we have because so many people who own property in Detroit neighborhoods don't live in those neighborhoods, and they are investments in a commercial sense rather than investments in a neighborhood sense.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add to Ted's point before, I answer your question is about, going back to the question of equity, because I was looking into the process of how people can make claims, and it is a pretty complicated process even before this week's ruling. And now with the question of retroactivity, it kind of changes things up too. And it forces you to think, well, who's going to have access to the resources, the legal resources and otherwise to make these claims? Is it going to be the landlords and speculators and investors who can kind of rally up lawyers and get their resources in place to make these claims? Or is it going to be the homeowners, right, who lost their properties to tax foreclosure and who maybe are renters right now, low income renters and homeowners and otherwise? And so I just wanted to bring up that point that it's going to be something to watch is the equity of being able to tap into getting the money back and who's going to be able to get the money back. And so, to answer your question, I think about the reporting that I've done on renters, for example, and the conditions of those homes. A lot of the times you'll see landlords and property owners who collect these properties, rent them out to low-income Detroiters, and then just don't keep up the properties, right? And so, and you see that across the city. The conditions of the homes are deplorable, right? I've walked into several homes with raw sewage coming up in the basement, and renters who are begging their landlord, who they cannot get into contact with, to do something about it. And then when they do complain, the landlord turns around and files an eviction against them. And so that's just a glaring example of just what happens when you have out-of-state investors and out-of-state landlords and out-of-touch property owners who don't connect with the community, who don't connect with the neighborhoods. And then you see the opposite, right? Where there are longtime Detroiters who are just struggling to keep their homes. They may have dealt with the tax foreclosure issue. They may have seen their neighbors leave because of the tax foreclosure crisis, but they're struggling to keep their family home, and they're struggling to, with the repairs. And so, across the city, you see this broad spectrum of issues of renters dealing with out-of-touch landlords who don't want to make repairs, Detroiters who lost their homes to property tax foreclosure and are those renters now, and then longtime Detroiters who are living in their family homes but are now struggling to make the repairs. And so you see just a broad range of these issues that I always come back to when we think about the question of out-of-state landlords and speculators and investors. I always come back to renters because I think you can always see the glaring example of what happens there. I know it's a little bit different from what we're talking about here, but that's kind of where we see the most glaring example of that.
Comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the irony of this also is that the reasons you'll hear for why the investors don't make repairs is that, well, the property isn't worth anything. It isn't worth anything because you bid $1,000 to buy it back, and you're collecting $700-800 a month back then.
Yes.
Rent every month, and you're getting your entire investment back in 2 months or less. But it isn't worth very much, so therefore they can't fix the sewage coming up. They can't fix the furnace. They can't fix, and it runs down to the point where it's another demolition bill for the city of Detroit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a cyclical issue. I mean, the investor behavior is part of what keeps property values low or lower than they could be, and then that becomes, as you point out, the excuse for not improving the property so people have better places to live. I mean, it really is one of the really complicated layers, I think, of the housing problems that we have here in Detroit. Alex, I want to give you a chance to also talk about investors, though, and again, the role that they're playing, even more broadly than the foreclosure issue, in the housing market in Detroit, and how that connects to again, the inability or the difficulty that so many folks have building wealth off of property.
Sure. Yeah, and I think the kinds of stories that Nusrat and Ted are sharing, are really like a very common practice, especially from 2010 to 2019 or so, where speculators, investors would buy hundreds of homes at these tax auctions, amass these really, really large portfolios. These weren't sort of individual property owners where maybe they had, 1 or 2 or 3 homes. They often would have portfolios of hundreds of homes. Mm-hmm. And the practice that they engaged in was known as milking properties, which I think was a term coined by Josh Akers in a really good paper out of University of Michigan. But their practice was that they would buy these hundreds of properties at auction for a few $1,000s a piece. As Ted said, they would extract rent from those properties for a few years while not paying the taxes, while not maintaining the properties. And then they would let many of them go right back into the auction where maybe they would buy them, maybe they would let them go. But the reality is that they're now going to get to profit off of both having rented out severely substandard housing to Detroiters for years, and then walking away from those properties. And because they these speculators owned portfolios of properties, they're not like homeowners. A homeowner might be able to capture windfall profits on one property, right? The house that they owned that was foreclosed. If these speculators had portfolios where dozens of properties generated windfall profits, they can go after that portfolio's worth of windfall profits. Yes. So I'm looking at, instances from the 2018 auction right now. An owner from Livonia who had 9 properties tax foreclosed with cumulative windfall profits of $106,000. An owner from Las Vegas with 5 properties, cumulative windfall profits of $73,000. 8 properties from an owner in Dallas, $53,000. And this is one auction year. They probably had other properties in other years of auctions, and they'll probably be able to add those into their windfall profit totals. And so, I think these cases that have made their way through the Supreme Court, the people arguing these cases have been very clever at finding very sympathetic stories and saying these stories that you're seeing, they're representative of everybody that we're fighting for, when in reality they're not. You're going to find far more cases of these speculators and investors who are positioned to profit off of this than of, as I said before, the very small number of homeowners whose properties even generated the conditions where windfall profits would be created. This is not something that's going to bring those people the justice that they deserve.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to speculate that these investors, someone's owed $100,000 from the county for these proceeds. It seems unlikely that money will get reinvested in improving the properties that they own.
Right.
Right. The people who depend on these properties for their homes always seem to be the folks who don't benefit from what's going on. Okay, we need to take another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some changes and solutions that might make all of this tax foreclosure issue more manageable for people in cities like Detroit. We're going to keep Alex Alsop, Ted Phillips, and Nusrat Rahman. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. Back with more Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm glad you've joined us. We're talking about the recent ruling by the Michigan Supreme Court that says that people who saw their properties seized for tax foreclosure and then sold by counties at a profit are entitled to those profits. They are entitled retroactively to those profits, and so there could be some very large bills being presented to counties very soon. We've got three great guests with us to talk about this. Alex Alsop is a VP of Research and Development for Regrid and the author of the Substack, The Chargeback. Ted Phillips is the director of the United Community Housing Coalition here in Detroit. And Nusrat Rahman is an economic mobility reporter for the Detroit Free Press and for Bridge Detroit. I want to start this section by talking about what we do about all of this, how we make a more nurturing and even safer housing market for people in the city of Detroit, and especially for poor people here in Detroit. Ted Phillips, UCHC, sees this stuff over and over again and tries to help people who find themselves in precarious situations with their housing. I imagine, though, that there are things you see frequently that you say, look, this doesn't have to be this way. If we would alter the policy landscape or other things, they might be better. Let's talk about the things that I guess are maybe low-hanging fruit even with regard to changing all of this.
Well, I think there has been a lot of progress made in the last several years with Detroit Board of Review and getting at the persons at poverty level and above for the what's we call the poverty tax exemption, the HOPE exemption in Detroit. And so I think there has been a lot of progress there in reducing the number of truly low-income families that are losing their homes. There's probably a lot more that needs to be done to be able to do outreach to make sure that everyone knows about that. But certainly that is one thing that has worked very well. We have continued on with a program called Make It Home, which has been to be the only positive aspect I've ever found of tax foreclosure, and that is that for those homes that have been tax foreclosed, we've been able to create, with this year's class, a little over 1,600 new homeowners, most of those tenants, through a program with the City of Detroit and supported by the Rocket Foundation. And so we've been able to have those homes taken out of foreclosure at the right of refusal period, which is in July and August usually. And those homes have been able to be purchased by the occupants for the taxes. So that's been a great opportunity for new people to become a lot of them never been homeowners before. Some of those are ones who fell through the cracks with the HOPE or the poverty exemption programs. But the majority of those are tenants. I think there's much more that needs to be done just to get the word out there as to what's available. There probably is a lot more that needs to be done to make sure that assessments are right. And we have had some progress on that. There was a period of time when everything was seemed to be, not everything, but most things seemed to be overassessed. Recently, we've had some studies out showing that property values over the last 10 years have nearly doubled. So I do suspect that there may be some properties right now that are a little bit underassessed, but we need to be sort of on top of that as well. But I think mostly making sure that people understand, and there needs to be funding to groups that are doing that, and being able to get out there and actually have. You can't put everything in a bureaucratic letter, and even if it's you try your best to get through, sometimes nothing matches the door to door, the talking to people one on one and explaining it. Yeah. And a lot of that's been done, but a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah. Nishrat, the things that are changing in the city for the better, and Ted talked about the rising property values, which are a story over and over again about how much better things are getting. In some ways, they are opening up, though, a wider gap between a lot of Detroiters who don't have access to that growth and that increase in wealth. Talk about how that mobility, the ability to move up in the world, gets strained by things like tax foreclosure and these other policies that we don't seem to be able to get a handle on.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question, I'll just point to the programs that are available and how overloaded they get, how many people apply for them. So over the past few years throughout the pandemic, we saw a lot of pandemic era funding that went into a lot of housing programs in the city, right? So I think of the down payment assistance program, I think of the home repair program. With the home repair program, we saw thousands of Detroiters apply for that. And even some other philanthropically funded repair programs. We saw thousands of Detroiters. We saw wait lists. With the down payment assistance program, I'm not exactly sure about the numbers for the phase 2 of that program, but I can bet that the numbers are pretty high in terms of the demand, right? And so there's a huge demand for housing assistance, whether that's for paying your back taxes, whether that's for rent assistance, whether that's for eviction help, whether that's for home repairs. There's a huge demand for it. And although the resources are slowly growing, what I hear over and over again from providers and service agencies is that, there's not enough to meet the demand, right? There's always going to be that constraint. And it's a story we've told over and over and over again. And although we are making progress, there's still a long way to go. One thing that I thought that was really interesting that came about throughout the pandemic was, I kept hearing over and over again from both providers and from residents is that when I'm going through something like a housing problem, I don't know where to go. Like, I don't know what number to call. A lot of people will call UCHC, right? Like that is the go-to place that they call. But otherwise they don't know where to go. And so the city of Detroit and a couple of partners came up with what's called the Detroit Housing Resource Helpline. So it's a phone number that directs you to one central place where you can be routed to get the help. Now, I can't say exactly what the experience is like for people. That's something we're going to be continuing to watch and see how effective it is. But that's meant to answer the question and the concern that a lot of Detroiters had, which is that if I'm going through a housing crisis, if I don't have a bed to sleep at, if my roof is caving in, what do I do? Who do I call? And especially if I don't have the money to get the resources, to get the hotel room, to get a contractor out there and pay however much it costs to get a roof repaired. And so that helpline is a place where Detroiters can go. But again, even when that launched, we saw, them fielding so many calls. When the home repair program started, we saw them fielding so many calls. And so I think with the reporting, it always goes back to the fact that demand outstrips the resources that are currently available. And what can we do to kind of ramp that up and make it a easier and more streamlined experience for Detroiters who are struggling?
Yeah. Alex, you've been writing about property. I'm sorry, Ted, I heard you jump in there.
Yeah, just real quick. And a lot of the support is for mortgages. And there needs to be a little bit more support for the really low-income populations are stuck in land contracts.
Yes.
And while they're a huge, more than time we have to talk about here, problem, they're also good land contracts. And there needs to be, first-time homebuyer assistance for people getting into those as long as they meet certain standards, like some of the nonprofits are doing with zero-interest land contracts and for cost land contracts, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. That's okay. Alex, you've been studying this issue for a really long time in Detroit. And so I'm sure that you have some things that you think would make a difference here. Give me some idea of what would be on your short list.
Sure. I would certainly echo what Ted said, which is that there's been a lot of progress, especially around the city of Detroit's property tax exemption, which is the HOPE program. So, the best way to not be hurt by the delinquent tax system and the tax foreclosure system is, to not fall behind on property taxes in the first place, or if you have tax debt, to get it eliminated. And for a long time, that was, much easier said than done. In 2014, 2015, there were only about 3,500 homeowners receiving the city's property tax exemption, and probably 35,000 to 40,000 that were qualified for it. The property tax exemption is much more accessible today. The HOPE program is much more accessible today. I think that we're close to 20,000 HOPE exemptions that are granted each year. And the HOPE exemption, when you get it, automatically triggers pay as you stay, which reduces any tax debt on the property, and the Detroit Tax Relief Fund, which pays off anything that pay as you stay doesn't address. So we actually have a fully retroactive property tax exemption at this point that can both eliminate the current year's tax burden for low-income homeowners and eliminate their tax debt. And that is by far the most important thing, is just to keep people out of the delinquent tax and tax foreclosure system altogether. And we can actually do that, but it's something that requires attention every year. The people who need property tax exemptions, we need to make sure that they are getting them every year, and that they don't wind up accumulating more property tax debt. So that's by far the biggest thing, is that we do not take attention away from the HOPE program and continuing to try to get as many homeowners as possible into that. And then, I think this is like triage. Repair was also mentioned. So, the most immediate threat is typically tax foreclosure. Once you've dealt with tax foreclosure, you need to move on to the conditions of the home itself, and create more ways for homeowners to get the repairs done that they need. And I think also for good actor landlords, that's something worth considering for them as well. There are a lot of Detroiters who own, especially today more so, a couple of properties that they rent out, or maybe a two-family home where they rent out one part of it. And if we have Detroiters who are good landlords and taking care of their property, supporting them and making repairs alongside homeowners, I think is worth considering as well.
Should this is a more complicated question than we probably have an opportunity to answer, Alex, but should we be doing this at all? This tax foreclosure issue is such a strange part of the dynamic here in Detroit, and the idea that for a couple $100 of delinquency, you can lose your home. What's the way we would even begin to make that more rational?
It's a really good question. I don't know. I think that my focus has been on, if we keep people out of the system, it can't hurt them.
Right.
Right. And we have much better ways to do that. There's no excuse for low-income homeowners in 2024 winding up in the tax foreclosure auctions. It's not. This is not putting the burden on them. It's putting the burden on the city and providers and philanthropy to make sure that the tools that we have are getting to the people that need it. That's the where the delivery needs to be happening. We need to make sure that everybody who qualifies for a property tax exemption and the Detroit Tax Relief Fund paying off their back taxes, that we get those resources to them. The system itself, has a very interesting history.
It does.
It was created by a libertarian think tank 25 years ago, and it's probably worth revisiting the process that created it.
Yeah. Okay, Alex Alsop, Ted Phillips, and Nusrat Rahman. It was really great, again, to have all three of your brains engaged on this issue and in this conversation. Thanks for being with us on Created Equal.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for us. Created Equal is produced by Kerry Jr. II and David Lyons. Our engineer is Nate Bender, and music is by Sam Bobian. It is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University.